David Marlow had always considered himself an ordinary man with an ordinary life. A dedicated husband, father, and an overworked accountant, he spent his days knee-deep in spreadsheets and his nights unwinding in front of the TV with his wife, Claire. They lived in a quaint, two-story house on a quiet suburban street, where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. But that facade of normalcy shattered the day he discovered Claire's affair. It happened by accident, as these things often do. David had come home early from work, feeling nauseous from the previous night's takeout. When he opened the door, he heard muffled voices coming from the living room. At first, he thought Claire had company, maybe a friend or a neighbor, but the intimate tones and soft laughter quickly set his teeth on edge. He crept closer, his heart pounding, and peered through the crack in the door. Claire was on the couch, her body tangled with a man David had never seen before. He felt a jolt of rage, and a bitter taste filled his mouth. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The wife he trusted, betraying him in their own home. David's first instinct was to burst in and confront them, but something stopped him. He didn't know if it was fear, shock, or something deeper, something darker. He backed away, retreating silently upstairs to their bedroom. His mind raced, thoughts swirling like a dark storm. The betrayal was painful, but his reaction was unsettling. He wasn't crying, or yelling, or even planning his next move. Instead, a strange calm settled over him, as if this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he hadn't yet grasped. That night, David didn't confront Claire. He didn't sleep, either. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Claire slipped into bed beside him around midnight, smelling of cheap cologne that wasn't his. David said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and waited for morning, feeling the first tendrils of a plan forming in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and David played the role of the oblivious husband. He watched Claire carefully, noting every lie she told and every time she slipped away to meet her lover. He started following her, learning the patterns of her deceit, and something twisted began to grow within him. A need for revenge that went beyond just exposing her infidelity. He wanted to hurt her, but not in any way she would expect. He wanted to destroy the sanctuary of their home, to unravel the life she had taken for granted. One day, while Claire was out, David decided to start his plan. He began with the attic, a place neither of them visited often. It was a dusty, cramped space filled with old boxes and forgotten items. As David climbed the narrow stairs, the air grew thick and cold. He pulled the string of the single overhead bulb, and it flickered to life, casting eerie shadows that danced on the wooden beams. David wasn't sure what he was looking for. He only knew that the house held secrets. He could feel it, like a presence lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He moved through the clutter, opening boxes and sifting through old photographs and clothes. Then, in the far corner, behind a stack of discarded furniture, he found something odd, a small, locked door that he had never noticed before. The door was no more than 4 feet high, set low into the wall, and covered in peeling white paint. It didn't look like it belonged there. It was as if someone had hastily added it and then tried to hide it. David's pulse quickened. He crouched down and ran his fingers over the cold wood, feeling the rusted hinges and the rough texture beneath his touch. There was no keyhole, just a simple iron latch. David hesitated. This was it, the first step into the unknown. He knew that whatever lay behind this door could change everything. But he was beyond caring about consequences. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. The smell hit him first, a rank, musty odor that made his stomach turn. He shone his flashlight into the space beyond, revealing a narrow passage lined with cobwebs and dust. The walls were made of crumbling brick, and the floor was uneven, like it had been hastily dug out long ago. The passage seemed to stretch on indefinitely, disappearing into the darkness. David's hand trembled as he held the light steady. He felt a chill run down his spine, and for the first time, he wondered if he should turn back. But the thought of Claire and her lover spurred him on. This was his house, and he would uncover its secrets, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, David stepped inside, unaware that he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As he ventured further into the passage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to discover the horrors it had kept hidden for so long. David's footsteps echoed softly as he moved deeper into the passage. Each step stirred the thick dust on the ground, creating swirls that seemed to dance in the beam of his flashlight. He brushed aside cobwebs that clung to his face, feeling the sticky threads trail across his skin. The narrow walls pressed in around him, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. The passage twisted and turned, disorienting him. David couldn't tell how far he had gone, or even if he was still under his house. He glanced back, but the doorway was lost in the darkness behind him. A growing sense of unease gnawed at his gut, but he pushed forward, driven by the anger that simmered just beneath his calm surface. After what felt like hours, David reached a dead end. The passage terminated abruptly at a solid wall, but something caught his eye, a small, tarnished metal box embedded in the brickwork. It was about the size of a shoe box, and its surface was engraved with strange symbols that David didn't recognize. He hesitated, feeling an odd sense of dread. The box radiated a faint heat, almost as if it were alive. With trembling hands, David pried the box loose from the wall. It was heavier than he expected, and when he shook it gently, he heard something rattling inside. He tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he decided to take it back upstairs to examine it further. As David turned to leave, he noticed something chilling. His footprints were the only ones in the dust. The realization sent a jolt of fear through him. There should have been others, traces of whoever had built this passage, or at least of animals that might have wandered in. But there was nothing. It was as if the passage had been waiting, untouched, just for him. Back in the attic, David examined the box under the dim light of the overhead bulb. The symbols on the lid seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, creating an optical illusion that made his head ache. After several attempts, he managed to pry the box open with a screwdriver. The lid popped off with a loud snap, revealing its contents, a collection of old, brittle photographs, yellowed with age. David sifted through the photos, his brow furrowing. They were images of people, families, couples, children, but all the faces were scratched out, leaving only faint outlines where their features should have been. Some of the photos showed the interior of a house, rooms that looked eerily familiar. He flipped through them faster, and his breath caught in his throat when he recognized one of the rooms. It was his living room, but not as it was now. The furniture was different, older, and the wallpaper was a floral pattern he had never seen before. Among the photos was a handwritten note, the ink faded and smudged. David squinted, trying to make out the words. "The house keeps what it claims. Leave while you can." A cold sweat broke out on David's forehead. He stared at the note, feeling a creeping sense of dread. He glanced around the attic, half expecting to see someone watching him. But there was nothing, just the silent shadows. David tried to shake off the feeling of unease as he descended back into the main part of the house. He told himself it was just an old attic filled with junk, and the photos were probably from previous owners. But the images stuck with him, especially the note. It felt like a warning, one he couldn't afford to ignore. Over the next few days, David's paranoia grew. He kept the box hidden in his office, away from Claire's prying eyes. He became obsessed with the house, convinced that it was hiding more secrets. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the pipes sent his heart racing. He started hearing noises at night, soft whispers and faint footsteps coming from the attic. Claire brushed it off, blaming old plumbing and his overactive imagination. One evening, as David sat in his office staring at the photos again, he heard a faint scratching sound. He looked up, expecting to see Claire at the door, but the hallway was empty. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like nails raking against wood. David grabbed his flashlight and followed the noise, his pulse quickening. The sound led him back to the attic. He hesitated at the foot of the stairs, but the scratching continued, relentless. David swallowed his fear and climbed up, one slow step at a time. As he reached the top, the noise stopped abruptly. He shone his flashlight around, searching for the source, but saw nothing unusual. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. David swung the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of a shadow darting behind a stack of boxes. His breath hitched, and he took a step back. The shadow was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. David turned to leave, but something on the floor caught his attention. A new photograph lay in the middle of the attic, one he hadn't seen before. His hands shook as he picked it up. The image was blurry, but he could make out two figures standing in what looked like his bedroom. One of them was Claire, but her face was scratched out. The other figure was a man, his face untouched, smiling at the camera with an expression that sent chills down David's spine. It was him. David's grip tightened on the photo, crumpling it in his hand. He felt his sanity slipping, unraveling like a loose thread. He stumbled back down the stairs, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Who had taken that photo? How did it get there? And why was it of him and Claire? Claire found him in the kitchen, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. She asked what was wrong, but David couldn't bring himself to tell her. He couldn't explain the photos, the box, or the strange passage in the attic. He couldn't explain why he felt like the house was closing in on him, like it was alive and watching his every move. That night, David barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scratched-out faces from the photos and the smiling image of himself, taunting him. He lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, convinced they were more than just the sounds of an old building settling. There was a presence here, something dark and malevolent that he couldn't escape. As the days passed, David's paranoia deepened. He started setting up cameras around the house, hoping to catch whatever was haunting him on tape. He spent hours watching the footage, but all he saw were empty rooms and flickering shadows. Claire grew concerned, but David brushed off her worries. He was close to something. He could feel it. He just didn't know what. One afternoon, while reviewing the footage, David noticed something odd in the basement camera feed. A section of the wall seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't entirely solid. He rewound the footage and played it again, zooming in on the wall. There was definitely something there, a faint outline, almost like a door. David grabbed his tools and headed to the basement, his heart racing with anticipation. He examined the wall, running his hands over the cold, rough surface. It felt solid, but the camera had shown something else. He tapped the bricks, listening for a hollow sound, and eventually, he found it. A small, hidden latch cleverly disguised among the bricks. He pried the latch open, revealing a narrow doorway. David hesitated, the memory of the attic passage fresh in his mind. But his need for answers overpowered his fear. He stepped through the doorway, into a small, cramped chamber lined with shelves. The air was thick and stale, and the only light came from his flashlight. The shelves were filled with jars, hundreds of them, each containing a strange, murky liquid. Floating inside were small objects that David couldn't quite make out. He picked up a jar, holding it closer to the light, and his stomach churned when he realized what he was looking at. Teeth. Human teeth, neatly arranged in rows, each jar labeled with a name and a date. David staggered back, nearly dropping the jar. He glanced around the chamber, his heart hammering in his chest. There were dozens of jars, each one meticulously labeled. He scanned the names, recognizing some from old newspapers about missing persons cases in the area. But one jar, tucked away on the top shelf, caught his eye. The label was newer, the ink still fresh. David Marlow. The date was today. David's blood ran cold. He fumbled with the jar, nearly dropping it as he scrambled to the exit. He burst out of the hidden chamber, his mind reeling. Someone had been in his house, collecting these jars, these trophies, and he was next on the list. Panic surged through him, but alongside it, a fierce determination. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to know who or what was doing this and why. David confronted Claire, demanding to know if she had ever seen the hidden chamber. She looked genuinely confused, her concern for his mental state growing. David stormed back to the attic, dragging her with him. He showed her the locked door, the passage, and the strange box. Claire's face paled as she looked at the photos, especially the one of David and the mysterious man. "I've never seen this before," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. David, what's happening? This can't be real. But it was real. Too real. David knew it in his bones. The house was hiding something monstrous, and it had chosen him. He spent the next few days researching the history of their home, digging through old records and archives. He found articles about the previous owners, many of whom had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The house had a dark past, one that seemed to repeat itself over and over. David's research led him to a man named Alastair Crow, the house's original builder. Crow was an eccentric architect with a penchant for the occult. Rumors swirled that he had constructed the house as a conduit for dark rituals, a place where he could commune with entities from beyond. Crow had vanished without a trace in 1910, and since then, every owner of the house had either died mysteriously or disappeared. David's hands shook as he read through the articles. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Crow had built it as a trap, a prison for souls, feeding on the lives of its inhabitants. And now it had set its sights on him. David knew he had to act fast. He packed a bag with essentials, ready to leave and never look back. But as he turned to tell Claire, he saw her standing in the doorway, her eyes glazed over, a strange smile on her lips. David, she said in a monotone voice, you can't leave. The house won't let you. Before he could react, Claire lunged at him, her hands clawing at his face. David shoved her away, shocked by her sudden aggression. She stumbled, then straightened up, her expression blank and distant, as if she were being controlled by something else. David locked himself in his office, barricading the door as Claire pounded on it from the other side. Her voice was unrecognizable, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. David grabbed his phone and tried to call for help, but the line was dead. He checked his cell, but it showed no signal. The house had cut him off from the outside world. The pounding on the door stopped, and everything went silent. David waited, his breath shallow, listening for any sound. He opened the office window, peering out into the backyard. There was no sign of Claire. Maybe she had given up, or maybe she was waiting for him to make a mistake. David climbed out of the window, dropping to the ground below. He crept along the side of the house, careful to avoid making any noise. As he reached the front yard, he saw Claire standing by the door, her back to him. She was holding something in her hands, a knife. David froze. He couldn't bring himself to hurt her, but he knew he couldn't let her get close. He backed away slowly, but Claire's head snapped around, her eyes locking onto him. She charged, the knife glinting in the sunlight. David ran, sprinting down the street, not daring to look back. He heard Claire's footsteps behind him, relentless and fast. He ducked into an alley, hiding behind a dumpster, his heart pounding in his chest. Claire ran past, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. David waited until Claire was out of sight before emerging from his hiding spot. He knew he couldn't keep running. He needed to confront whatever was controlling her, whatever was haunting the house. He circled back, sneaking into the backyard and re-entering the house through the basement window. The house was quiet, too quiet. David felt like he was being watched, every hair on his body standing on end. He made his way back to the hidden chamber, determined to find a way to break the curse. He tore through the shelves, searching for anything that might help him. In the corner, he found a dusty old book bound in leather, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. It was Crow's journal, a record of his dark rituals and the house's true purpose. David flipped through the pages, finding a ritual to banish the entities that Crow had summoned. It was dangerous and required a sacrifice, but David knew it was his only chance. He gathered the items needed for the ritual, a piece of his own hair, a drop of blood, and the box of photographs. He set up the ritual in the basement, drawing the symbols on the floor with chalk and lighting candles around the perimeter. As he began the incantation, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floor shook, and a cold wind whipped through the room, extinguishing the candles. David's voice wavered, but he kept going, shouting the words over the deafening noise. Suddenly, Claire appeared in the doorway, her face twisted in rage. She lunged at David, but he held her back, finishing the incantation. There was a blinding flash of light, and David was thrown back against the wall. When David came to, the house was silent. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone. He looked around, disoriented but relieved. The ritual had worked. The entities were gone, and the curse was broken. Claire lay on the floor, unconscious but alive. David rushed to her side, shaking her gently. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, confused but no longer possessed. "David, what happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "It's over," David said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's finally over." They left the house that night, taking only what they could carry. They never looked back, and they never spoke of what happened. The house stood empty, its secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to uncover them. David and Claire moved far away, starting fresh in a new city. They tried to put the past behind them, but the scars of their ordeal lingered. David couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching them, its presence lurking in the shadows of his mind. He started seeing a therapist, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He told the story over and over, but no one believed him. The photos, the hidden chambers, the jars of teeth, it all sounded too fantastical, like the ravings of a madman. But David knew the truth. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt. He kept Crow's journal, a reminder of the horrors they had faced. Sometimes, late at night, he would open it and read the final pages, the ones Crow had written just before his disappearance. The last entry sent chills down David's spine every time he read it. "The house is hungry. It will never stop. It will keep taking and taking until there's nothing left." Years passed, and David tried to move on. He and Claire rebuilt their lives, but the shadow of the house never fully left them. David found himself drawn back to the old neighborhood one day, unable to resist the pull. He parked down the street and walked towards the house, now abandoned and overgrown. It looked just as he remembered, its windows dark and empty. David stood in front of it, staring up at the peeling paint and sagging roof. He felt a familiar chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to step closer. As he approached the front door, it creaked open on its own. David hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, but something compelled him forward, into the darkness. The house was silent, but David felt a presence all around him. He walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on the dusty floor. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the house was holding its breath. David reached the attic stairs, and without thinking, he climbed them. The door to the passage was still there, the latch slightly ajar. David pushed it open, stepping into the darkness once more. He walked the familiar path, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. As he reached the end of the passage, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The metal box was back, sealed and untouched, its symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. David backed away, his heart racing. He turned to leave, but the passage seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly. He ran, panic flooding his senses, but the exit was nowhere in sight. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air grew thick and heavy. David's flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging him into complete darkness. He felt his way along the walls, desperate to find the exit, but the house had other plans. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the darkness. He felt something brush against his arm, cold and clammy like a dead hand. He recoiled, slamming into the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The house was alive, its walls pulsing with a sickly rhythm. David could feel it in his bones, a low hum that vibrated through him. He realized then that the house hadn't let him leave all those years ago. It had simply let him think he had escaped. David felt a surge of anger and defiance. He wouldn't be its victim again. He fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to guide him. The passage twisted and turned, but David kept going, driven by a desperate need to survive. He finally saw a faint light up ahead, the exit. David sprinted towards it, his lungs burning with each breath. He burst through the door, collapsing onto the attic floor. The passage sealed shut behind him, the door vanishing into the wall. David lay there, gasping for air, his mind reeling. He had made it out, But he knew the house wasn't done with him. It never would be. It was a predator, a hunter, and he was its prey. David didn't tell Claire about his return to the house. He couldn't bear to drag her back into its grip, but he knew he couldn't escape its reach forever. The house was a part of him now, a dark shadow that loomed over his every waking moment. He tried to live a normal life, but the nightmares never stopped. He dreamed of the passage, of the jars of teeth, and of Crow's smiling face. He saw his own name etched on every wall, a constant reminder of the house's hold on him. David spent the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, waiting for the house to call him back. He knew it was only a matter of time. The house was patient. It would wait, biding its time until David was too old, too weak to resist. And when that day came, David knew he would answer. He would return to the house, to the darkness, to the endless passage that twisted and turned forever. Because the house kept what it claimed, and it would never, ever let him go.